Good afternoon and welcome to XM's 2021 annual conference. I hope that you have enjoyed the event thus far. My name is Lisa Terry and I serve as XM's Chief Ethics Officer. In this session, we are going to provide you an overview of the measures XM undertakes to prevent fraud in its programs and operations. First, you will hear from me. You will then hear from Walter Hill, Vice President of Credit Policy and Compliance, Christopher Sutton, Chief Information Security Officer, and John Connor, Assistant General Counsel for Fraud, Litigation, and Compliance. At the conclusion of our remarks, we will take any questions you may have. Please submit your questions in the chat box. And time permitting, we will aim to address all of the questions at the end of the session. Thank you. Here you will see an outline of the topics we're going to cover in the next 20 to 40 minutes. Ethics and fraud, XM fraud strategy and fraud indicators, cyber fraud, and finally, financial crimes and customer due diligence. So as I mentioned, I'm the Chief Ethics Officer, and the Office of Ethics plays an important role in fraud prevention. We do this by instituting new agency-wide ethics-related requirements. These requirements might come from the Office of Government Ethics, also known as OGE. The Office of Government Ethics is the oversight agency responsible for the government-wide ethics program. They often issue policies, standards, and sometimes regulatory requirements that agencies are required to implement. And some of these touch on how we're able to use ethics to prevent fraud at XM. XM also introduces its own agency-wide policies. Most recently, we adopted a policy on conflicts of interest and recusals. This policy requires all employees who have a financial conflict of interest in a matter that they're working on to recuse themselves from the matter and to report that recusal to the Office of Ethics. We also sometimes look at private sector best practices. Sometimes the private sector does things and conducts themselves in ways and standards that have some translation to government and how we conduct ourselves in the government. So we also look at private sector best practices to discover ways to use ethics to prevent fraud. XM also has a very robust education and training program. We do annual mandatory agency-wide training, which is required 100% by every employee at XM Bank. We also implemented this year targeted ethics briefings. These are briefings that are narrowly tailored to address issues that are specific to certain groups and divisions around the bank. And finally, we issue monthly newsletters. These newsletters are aimed at educating staff on the ethics laws and the conduct to which they are held. We emphasize avoiding conflicts of interest. We aim to teach staff the conflict of interest laws. And we also focus on real case prosecutions that are held by the Department of Justice as a way to help prevent fraud. Here you see XM's Code of Business Conduct and Ethics. One of the most important steps XM took in 2020 was the adoption of its first ever Code of Business Conduct and Ethics. Every member of XM in 2020 was required in writing to acknowledge receipt of the code and to agree by its context. Here you'll see, this is a page from our code. The code is available on xm.gov. And here you'll see the 6 principles that we adopted as important in the way that we conduct business at XM Bank. Those are integrity, accountability, stewardship, commitment to ethics, focus on being customer focused, and embracing innovation. And here is another page from our code that focuses more specifically on the values and the principles that we adopted. The code discusses in great detail some of these values that we think are important in how we conduct business. And the ones that focus on fraud prevention, we talk about anti-corruption, anti-bribery. We talk about the importance of sanctions compliance. We stress avoiding financial conflicts of interest, prohibitions on insider trading, also the importance of protecting confidential business information, the importance of enterprise risk management, which you will hear more about in this session, and transparency. And lastly, we have to say a word about how we safeguard our business values and beliefs. It's one thing to adopt them, but then we have to focus on how we actually protect them. And we do that by adopting a work environment where we invite, provide, and respect challenge, being fully responsible for XM's risk. And that means everyone is responsible for XM's risk from the top down to the bottom up, being rigorous and forward-looking and comprehensive in the assessment of risk, troubleshooting collectively, and placing XM and its reputation at the center of all decisions. And you'll see here at the top of this slide, something I think many of us have heard: see something, say something. That is a very important phrase that we embrace around the bank. We encourage staff to report any concerns that they may have in the business matters that they're working on. They can do that through my office, the Office of Ethics, through the Office of Inspector General, and of course to supervisory staff as appropriate. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you for your attention. And I'd now like to pass it over to Walter Hill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. My name is Walter Hill. I'm the Vice President of Credit Policy and Compliance, and am a member of the Fraud Risk Oversight Team. As we look at slide number 8, fraud and financial crimes, the strategy we have developed has been a strategy over probably 2 decades worth of learning. We suffered some fraud in the early 2000s, and we learned some tremendous lessons. From those lessons, we implemented a number of internal controls around the fraud space that have paid dividends over time. Additionally, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've worked with and have implemented the GAO, the Governmental Accounting Agency, and we've implemented its fraud risk oversight strategy. So we've used those tools to combat financial crimes, bribery, corruption, money laundering, and sanctions violations. There are various types of fraud and financial crimes. Some of them are financial, some are non-financial. For example, personal identifiable information, PII. There's also cyber fraud, the conflicts of interest, bribery, money laundering, a host of contract and procurement issues, including sanctions violations. The impacts of fraud are wide and varied. We're all familiar with financial loss, but there's also potentially as significant reputational or political risk that goes with impacts of fraud. You also have legal implications, operational and strategic implications. As we go to the next page, we will show the 2015 GAO Fraud Risk Framework. There are 4 pillars to that framework. The first is commit. It is where the agency shows how important the issue is from the top to the bottom. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The second is to assess the fraud risk throughout the agency. We have agreed to do that every 2 years. We'll do a deep dive fraud risk assessment. In the off years, we perform a fraud risk survey. So we just completed our second in FY21 full-fledged fraud risk assessment. The third element is design and implement. Depending on the findings of the assessment, there may be a need to add some controls or enhance some controls. It is in that assessment that the design and implement piece comes in terms of shoring up the control environment. The fourth and final pillar is the evaluate and adapt. This is a more forward-looking process, one to put in risk indicators, and we are working to do that as we speak. In terms of commitment at XM, it is a full agency commitment from the president and chairman down to the chief risk officer, a position which is denoted in our charter, and so it's congressionally mandated. And the chief risk officer heads the enterprise risk committee, which is a committee where all types of risks, including fraud risks, are brought to the agency to discuss and to determine next steps. We operate under a 3 lines of defense model. The front line are the originators or loan officers. The second line of defense is the Office of Risk Management, of which I'm a part. And the third line are our external regulators, the GAO and the Office of Inspector General. Finally, it's bank staff. As I mentioned, it is a holistic approach to fraud risk. Everyone in the agency has a role in fraud risk management. There are a number of key activities in fraud risk management. It is important to identify the fraud risk. And fraud risk is different than fraud. The difference is fraud is an event that you suffer a loss, either financial, or reputational, or otherwise. Fraud risk is inherent in some of the businesses that we do. And so to remediate and to put to zero the fraud risk, you would have to stop doing certain businesses. The goal is to be able to detect, prevent, and to mitigate fraud as you see it. And we do that through the second piece, which is the fraud risk assessment. As I mentioned, we look at that on an annual basis, in a deep dive every 2 years, and a more lighter touch in the off years. The focus is to measure the likelihood and impact of key fraud risks. And we also, in that process, evaluate the existing controls. And to the extent there needs to be some updating or enhancement of those controls, we develop a remediation plan. All of those things go to assure our key parties, the risk committee internally, and our third line of defense, the GAO and the Office of Inspector General, that we are on top of our fraud risks and are managing those risks appropriately. One of the most important things we do and our partners do is to know who you're doing business with, know your customer. Well, who do you do KYC, due diligence on? Everybody involved with the transaction, from the buyers, obligors, and end users, to the exporters, the lenders in the transaction, any agents on either side of the deal, as well as the suppliers in the transaction. It is important to have a clear understanding of who you're doing business with. That is due diligence rule number 1, KYC. Rule number 2, know your transaction. We implore our staff and our partners to exercise professional skepticism. Does the transaction make sense on its face? Are the prices reasonable? Is the flow of money reasonable? Does it make sense? Did anyone ask for a bribe or a kickback? You may think that's a silly question, but it happens. Do all the parties involved have appropriate experience in the goods or services being exported? What is their background reputation? Again, it's knowing your customer, knowing your transaction. If there is if an agent is being paid, where is that money coming from? What service is he or she providing? Follow the money. Are there aspects of a transaction that are not essential? For an example, if there's a project that is giving a contribution, a charitable donation to an NGO, who's watching how that money is spent and to whom that money goes? Again, follow the money. Perhaps most importantly, know who you are doing business with. There was a case in point with a government in the Middle East, and all the transaction details looked legitimate, with the exception of 1 digit in a phone number was off. And that allowed a fraudulent transaction to take place. Know your transaction, know your customer. We engage at XM in a multi-pronged approach to combating fraud. I spoke a moment ago about the commitment from the top of the agency to the bottom of the agency. We also have put in place a number of controls, again, as we suffered some fraud in the early 2000s. And so we have sufficiently and significantly mitigated the scope of the fraud that is perpetrated on XM. Having said that, the scope of fraud has expanded significantly since those early 2000 situations to include anti-money laundering and cybersecurity issues. So it is imperative that across the agency, we engage in activities that monitor these risks and mitigate these risks from top to bottom. We focus on continuous improvement, and every dollar matters in terms of our business, whether it's fraud on XM or fraud on parties who deal with XM. So in that instance, we are very much focused on all of our due diligence. And now I will hand it over to Christopher Sutton, who will talk about the threats we face in the cybersecurity area.
Thank you, Walter. Hello, everyone. As Walter said, my name is Chris Sutton, Chief Information Security Officer for XM Bank. Today, I want to speak to you about cybersecurity, specifically about the most common types of cyber threats faced by XM and best practices that we leverage and which you can also use to protect your business and yourself from online fraud. You can see here from my first slide that cybersecurity is an issue of profound importance in today's technology-driven world, and the banking sector is no exception to this. The banking sector is one of the most highly targeted sectors for cyber attacks, putting XM Bank square in the crosshairs of multiple threats. We face threats of various complexities and from multiple sources, ranging from novice attackers to well-funded groups who can potentially pose serious risk to XM's ability to operate safely in cyberspace. Common to many financial institutions, we here at XM are seeing that cyber attacks such as business email compromise, ransomware, and social engineering and phishing have increased in frequency against the bank. So let's explore a bit more of these attacks, their impact, and what's being done by XM and what can also be done by you to help protect against them. For my next slide, we'll discuss business email compromise attacks. Business email compromise attacks, or as they're commonly known, BEC attacks, are one of the most lucrative schemes that we see in both small and large businesses, and also targeting personal transactions. This type of scam focuses on individuals and businesses whom perform legitimate transfer of funds requests or transactions. This scam is frequently carried out when an attacker compromises or is able to successfully impersonate the email account belonging to a person or legitimate business. This is done for the purpose of using the account as a vehicle to help trick business personnel in charge of approving the payout of funds to transfer those funds to an account belonging to the attacker, instead of the receiving account, which is legitimately entitled to receive the funds. The attacker is often able to do this by repeating to business personnel in charge of approving payout of funds key information that the attacker collected from the internet. Specifically, this information is often taken by the attacker from publicly available business and personal websites and social media accounts. The attacker then includes this information in their communication to the target, in this case, again, personnel in charge of approving the payout of funds, to make the attacker's request seem legitimate to transfer funds to an unauthorized account belonging to that attacker. The attacker may do this via their ability to break into or impersonate the email account of personnel in charge of payout of funds, and then send an email from that account requesting that the funds be transferred to an account of the attacker's choosing. This type of scam continues to grow and evolve, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, also known as the FBI, reporting that the scam has been reported in all 50 of the United States and nearly 200 countries, and that overseas countries remain the primary destination for the stealing of funds. On your screen, you will see a screenshot of a public service announcement that comes from the FBI, which focuses on business email compromise. When expanded upon, the public service announcement contains additional statistics related to business email compromise, which confirm that business email compromise attacks are one of the most lucrative types of cyber fraud taking place. Victims of business email compromise range from individuals to small business to large corporations, with no specific sector of the economy targeted more than the other, but simply for the purpose to gain unauthorized access to funds. From May of 2018 to 2019, sectors affected by business email compromise saw a 100% increase in identified losses. Business email compromises have been responsible for over 26 billion in funds lost. From the last several years, incidents reported by the FBI have identified almost 70,000 US victims, totaling over 10 billion in funds lost. And for our international stakeholders, these numbers for the same time period translate to nearly 4,000 victims and over 1 billion in funds lost. So for my next slide, we've identified a couple scenarios that we wanted to share with you, so that from a customer or business perspective, you have a better understanding of how you can protect yourself or your organization from cyber fraud caused by business email compromise, ransomware, and social engineering and phishing. One of our scenarios that I'd like to share focuses on a victim company exporter that shipped approximately $67,000 of its product to a customer. After doing so, the customer received follow-up emails, later identified as fraudulent, directing payment to an account unrelated to the exporter. Up to this point, everything about this particular event seemed in line with traditional business processes. However, in this scenario, and as mentioned earlier in this presentation, there was a legitimate account that was compromised. And as a result, the attacker who compromised the account sent out a fraudulent email, again, to personnel in charge of approving the payout of funds, to transfer payment for the product to an account owned by the attacker. Afterwards, the account was then closed and a check was issued to the fraudulent account holder. As soon as this information was detected, our Office of the Inspector General reached out to the victim company exporter and conducted an investigation. Fortunately, our Office of the Inspector General and Exum team did a great job in working with the exporter to understand and identify that there were underlying issues associated with this event. The criminal was later found and prosecuted and has been faced with court charges for a significant term of imprisonment, fines, and period of supervised release. This is just one example of a business email compromise case that has taken place identified here at Exum. So for my next slide, we will see that for 2020 to 2021, we have seen thousands of small and large businesses around the world affected by ransomware, as networks were essentially held hostage by it and the attackers whom operated it. Ransomware is a scam that targets both businesses and individuals by locking up or encrypting their systems and demanding cash to return the computer to normal operations, and in some cases, not have the computer's data released publicly. Ransomware attacks are often facilitated by phishing attacks, which are used to gain access to target computers for the purpose of installing ransomware on them. Ransomware has quickly become one of the most common of all cyber frauds directed at businesses. In fact, ransomware attacks have grown at such a high volume that it's now rated the #1 cybersecurity threat by many cybersecurity and business professionals. The banking sector is a large target for many different groups, from organized criminals seeking to steal money to politically motivated groups attempting to make a statement. Of note, small businesses are highly targeted because they are viewed as easy targets with less robust cybersecurity programs. On your screen, you will see a screenshot from Cybersecurity Ventures, which estimates that in 2020, ransomware attacks were responsible for damages totaling 20 billion in funds. The FBI has reported that also in 2020, over 2,400 ransomware cases were reported. In my next slide, you will see that Exum has seen ransomware, and we consider ourselves relatively sophisticated. However, we consider this a serious threat worthy of executive attention. When you look at the impact that ransomware can have, ensuring you have mitigation strategies in place, such as well thought out incident response and business continuity plans, really helps to make the difference between the type and amount of impact the ransomware can have on your organization. Another of the scenarios that I'd like to share focuses on an Exum staffer whom received an email with a malicious attachment. When the Exum staffer opened the attachment, ransomware was downloaded to the computer and encrypted its hard drive. This event resulted in no significant data loss, as Exum had policies in place which limited the result of the infection to only loss of productivity for the one affected staffer. The event resulted in a comprehensive review of Exum security architecture and policies in place that protect Exum from ransomware. Even though this event was confined to one Exum staffer's laptop, the number of resources, primarily personnel, required to confirm the ransomware, its impact, and coordinate a mitigation strategy was indeed substantial. Many reputable sources, such as the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or FSISAC as it's also known, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST as it's also known, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO as it's also known, the US Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI as it's also known, provide industry-leading approaches to ransomware management, which are both applicable and available to small and large businesses and individuals, either upon request, by visiting their website, or becoming a member. In my next slide, I mentioned earlier about social engineering and phishing. Cyber fraud often starts with social engineering and phishing, which are malicious activities that occur when an attacker, either through in-person contact or digital platforms such as email, social media, or telephone, use manipulation to try to trick you into giving away sensitive information or making security mistakes that may cause you or your organization harm. Exum has experienced cases of attackers posing as employees and requesting to make connections via social media. On your screen, you will see a screenshot of a Jane Doe LinkedIn user. This represents a popular tactic used by attackers to leverage social media to facilitate social engineering scams. We've also experienced one attacker whom facilitated a phishing scam by claiming that the coronavirus pandemic caused disruption to their export and import business and their ability to access the Exum network. As a result of this phisher or attacker solicited Exum staff to connect via social media and exchange personal information. In this scenario, the attacker was trying to encourage staff to comply with his or her request for a multitude of reasons, which could have been for stealing their identity, verifying their personal or business email address, or for gathering information to potentially set up a forthcoming business email compromise scam. Based off the increased number of social engineering attempts, we did reach out and coordinate with our Office of the Inspector General, whom conducted an investigation and worked with sites being used to facilitate social engineering to identify the fraudulent accounts and see what can be done from a legal perspective to have those accounts removed. We ask that people pay attention to these types of requests for social media connections and exchanges of information, and be cognizant of the type of information you're sharing related to your personal and business experiences, as you're always a target based off what you're posting and the information that's publicly available. On your screen, you will also see a screenshot of a phishing advisory from the Department of Homeland Security and the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which, when expanded upon, provides additional information about why and how phishing attacks are used, and simple but effective tips, of which I will discuss more about in the next slide, to help prevent you and your organization from becoming a victim of phishing attacks. Again, we encourage you to routinely seek out information from reputable sources to raise awareness of these threats and to provide information to protect you or your organization from them. So moving now to my next slide. We have talked about key threats that cause cyber fraud, but now I want to talk about what we can do to help protect ourselves from them. One of the best examples that I learned when I first started focusing on cybersecurity is that you want to protect your information systems, such as your email or your website, the same way you would protect your house. So just as your house may have multiple types of security defenses, such as motion detection cameras, a fenced-in yard, locked doors and windows, and an alarm system, You also want to set up a similar type of layered defense for your information systems. When you buy a house, you have a fenced-in yard to manage your home's perimeter. That fenced-in yard would be similar to having your organization protected by a firewall to help protect against cyber threats attempting to get inside your organization's perimeter. For your house, you will also have a front door with a specific lock and key. That front door with its own unique lock and key would be similar to having sufficient password and two-factor authentication policies in place to help verify that only approved users have access to your information systems and associated data. For your house, you may have locks on your windows to help prevent unauthorized access to it. Those locks on your windows would be similar to having a regularly updated antivirus program running on your computers to prevent viruses or ransomware from impacting their operation or information stored on them. And finally, for your house, you may also have an alarm system to help protect against someone trying to break into it. That alarm system would be similar to access controls placed on your organization's information repositories to only allow authorized access to your organization's information. Essentially, to protect yourself, we need to have controls, just as mentioned in this analogy. You want to make sure that you're implementing key administrative and technical controls for your organization. Administrative controls focus on processes, policies, training, and education. However, technical controls are system capabilities and features which protect you or your business or mitigate harm if something unfortunate should happen. With regard to administrative controls to help prevent cyber fraud, you want to implement clear procedures for the disbursement of funds. Going through a multi-step, multi-person verification process that allows for an extra set of eyes to ensure that a transaction request makes sense. Tight controls are required around payments or disbursement of funds being made to ensure it goes to the right place. You should also want to work with your customers and vendors to ensure that it's important to confirm this kind of information to help prevent an attacker from getting in the middle of your financial transaction. You might also try to validate the legitimacy of the transaction with an independent phone call to your business contact to verify information that only you and the business contact would know and wasn't previously included in any email supporting the financial transaction. For Exum customers, this could be done by going to exum.gov and calling our office to begin the verification process. And remember, go with your gut. If it feels wrong, it might be wrong. It doesn't hurt to ask questions to verify if a financial transaction makes sense. Having independent confirmation for your transaction process may add an additional step, but it could protect you, your business, and your customers from cyber fraud. Our first line of defense is our staff, our customers, and our users. We want to ensure that they're aware of the different types of fraud and phishing schemes that are taking place. It's important to conduct as much cybersecurity informational outreach as possible internal to your organization and user base, so that you can make sure that people are aware of the different types of fraud and ways to protect themselves against it. There's a lot of free information available from reputable sources, which were mentioned previously, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation and US Department of Homeland Security, which are constantly posting information related to cyber-enabled business schemes and trending data. Additionally, you want to make sure that you're taking precaution with what you post, what you share, and what you say on social media. With regard to your company website, limit information to only what is most appropriate to make it difficult for attackers to try to impersonate you or your customers. Also, you'll always want to judge carefully about the type and amount of information that is made publicly available so that you don't put yourself or your organization in a vulnerable position should it be used to facilitate a cyber scam. With regard to technical controls to help prevent cyber fraud, one very common and important thing that we urge you to focus on is the implementation of two-factor authentication to access email in your organization's network. This will add an additional level of security to help prevent the compromise of an account or to help ensure that only authorized individuals are accessing accounts and associated information. Also, Work with your email, internet, and network providers to enable fake or fraudulent email detection capabilities. And make sure you keep your personal and business accounts separate and don't share the same passwords across them. This becomes especially important if you use the same password for your business account that you use for any third-party website that may become compromised. If through the course of that compromise, the password from that third-party website is then obtained by the attacker could potentially use that password to also access your business and steal your associated information. Also, ensure that you know who you're dealing with. And if you've been contacted by a suspicious user, don't share business or personal information that you think is sensitive, and report the activity to the appropriate person or team within the organization or vendor you're using. And last, but certainly not least, ensure you periodically back up your data to a separate location so you can recover the data and resume business operations or personal pursuits in the case of a physical network loss or ransomware event. It's also very important to periodically test your backup data solution to ensure it also works appropriately. So this concludes my presentation. Before I end, I want to share with you that if you do suspect or have information concerning possible cyber fraud, please do not hesitate to reach out. You may submit your information to our Office of the Inspector General, whose contact information is posted on EXIM.gov under Contact Us. Thank you for your time today. This concludes my presentation, and I will hand it over to Mr. John Connor, our Assistant General Counsel.
Thanks, Chris. And hello, everybody. I'm John Connor. I'm the Assistant General Counsel for Litigation, Fraud, and Compliance at Exim Bank. I've been with Exim Bank a little over 20 years now, working in trade finance, compliance, fraud, and related areas. So Walt had earlier talked to you about how we take a multi-pronged approach to combating fraud. And this sort of has two levels. One is we take a multi-level approach. So we have our fraud risk oversight team, as you see on the slide. That consists of me, Walter Hill, I'm referring to, who you heard from earlier, and Lisa Terry, who you also heard from earlier. And we manage the different aspects of fraud risk management at Exim Bank. However, as I'm sure you understand, fraud is a duty, anti-fraud, fighting fraud is a duty of everybody in the bank. And that's why we go into a lot of training, et cetera, to make sure that people are constantly aware of fraud risks and paying attention to them. But the multi-pronged approach isn't just a multi-level approach, it's also an increasingly expanding approach. So our fraud and our fraud issues, particularly our due diligence related to combating fraud, also applies with regard to our anti-money laundering efforts, our anti-bribery efforts. It relates to our suspension and debarment, and our sanctions screening and prevention. So one of the most important partners in our multi-pronged approach is the Office of the Inspector General. As many of you know, we got an Office of the Inspector General back in 2007, and since that time, they've been instrumental in helping us to combat fraud, investigate fraud, and prosecute fraud. We are very fortunate to have them here. The Office of the Inspector General, for those of you that don't know, has a unit, the Investigations Unit, the Office of Investigations, that is staffed by several special agents who are agents just like FBI agents, same powers and authority. And so they are tremendously helpful to us in investigating suspicious activities. And one of the procedures that we follow is any reasonable suspicion of any kind of fraud or any criminal wrongdoing is automatically referred to the Office of Investigations in the Office of Inspector General, and then the bank works with them to investigate and support prosecutions. This multi-pronged approach to combating fraud took a little while to put in place, but it's been in place for many years at this point, and it has been very successful. All of what we call our fraud indicators, our primary fraud indicators, are down, they have been down, and continue to be down. So one of the primary anti-fraud indicators or indicators of fraud is our claims level. And our claims continue to be at a low level, notwithstanding the pandemic. Overall, our claims are at a pretty low level. In addition, the suspicious activity referrals that I mentioned in connection with the last slide are down. We have really very few of those, despite constant vigilance by the staff in looking out for suspicious activity. And then finally, the investigation feedback that we get is down. That is to say, the information that we get back from investigations indicating that there may be things going on out there that we have not been paying attention to. All of these are down. Now, a minute ago, I talked about how we've expanded sort of the scope of our anti-fraud strategy to include AML, anti-money laundering, sanctions prevention, anti-bribery. We don't have clear indicators for those activities. That is something we continue to work on, continue to watch, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But unlike the fraud indicators, we don't have specific indicators that we can point to in connection with those aspects of fraud. So one of the things we do in our multi-pronged approach to combating fraud is we keep an eye on what's going on out there in the world. And one of the helpful places to look is fraud reports that come out of the multilateral banks and agencies. So just recently, you might have seen that the European Investment Bank came out with its fraud report. And I noticed this particular quote in their report. And I'm going to read the whole thing. It's not too long. Most of the cases related to the fraudulent use of the EIB's or EIF's name on websites, email addresses, or social media profiles to embezzle money from individuals or businesses. In other cases, individuals falsely claim to act as intermediaries for the EIB group and ask for fee payments for this fake service. This is precisely the kind of fraud that we have seen on the increase at Exim Bank over the past several years, and in particular, over the past year in connection with the pandemic. That is to say, it is actually not a fraud on Exim Bank where Exim Bank is going to sustain the loss, but where Exim Bank's name is used in some misrepresentative way, and then third parties are conned out of their money by use of our name. I have to say I am constantly amazed at how often people will just hand over money based on mere representations of somebody's role. So it is something you all need to be very careful of, and you should advise your business partners to be careful of it. That being said, con men are good. That's why we have, as Chris was talking about, so much phishing going on. Con men know how to tap into our deepest desires and extract information from us, and in this case, money. So I thought it was very interesting that in this case, the EIB was having the exact same kind of fraud that we are having. So in connection with this broadening scope of our anti-fraud efforts, we are continually trying to improve our due diligence. Due diligence, as I'm sure you all know, really lies at the heart of the anti-fraud efforts, compliance efforts, etc. So we have created at the bank, the Chief of Staff created a customer due diligence working group that is staffed by me and other members of the fraud risk oversight team, as well as representatives from various business units in the bank. And what we are doing is reviewing our approach to all kinds of financial crime. People sometimes these days call it illicit finance, financial crime. It's all the same thing. Again, for us, the focus is on not only fraud, but the anti-money laundering, the anti-bribery, sanctions prevention. And of course, a huge part of this is our continued anti-fraud training, which we do on various levels. We do it on a bank-wide level. We do it on a business unit level. We do it just on the level of sending out email reminders to people. And some of you will have seen that our broker relations people have sent email reminders regarding phishing risks, et cetera, to our brokers and to our insureds. This is all by way of trying to make sure that people keep fraud and keep these other compliance risks at the forefront of their minds. So I'm sure you've all seen this statement. You can't do good business with bad people. I believe it's attributed to Warren Buffett, but could be somebody else. But recent concerns and approaches to customer due diligence and fraud have sort of created a corollary to this. And that corollary is you actually can't do good business with good people who do business with bad people. And essentially what that means is there is a growing awareness that customer due diligence has to extend not only to your own compliance issues, not only to your own systems, but to the partners that you do business with directly, and then also to the partners that they do business with on down the chain, whether that's the supply chain or other, your sales chain. Sometimes it's just called supply chain risk. But there is more and more focus on this broader approach to customer due diligence. The regulatory expectations in this connection have been continuing to grow also. The guidance out of DOJ, FinCEN, et cetera, with regard to what your compliance system should look at is increasingly focused on making sure that your customer due diligence extends out to the chains of parties that you're doing business with. This is especially true in related areas pertaining to human rights violations and what they call the ESG concerns, but they also apply to the illicit finance concerns. Some examples of this are in 2020, most of you are probably aware that there was a significant expansion in FinCEN's role under the, I believe it was the National Defense Authorization Act. They included the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, which created a beneficial ownership registry where companies are required to give their beneficial ownership information. Now, at this point, this is housed only within the government and used only for government purposes, so it's not generally available to the private sector, but it is very helpful and hopefully will be helpful with regard to investigations of money laundering. In addition, there's an increased focus on corruption. President Biden in June issued a presidential memorandum establishing the fight against corruption as a core national security interest. It essentially putting everybody on notice, but especially government agencies on notice, that they really have to be focusing on corruption concerns. Finally, there are the Chinese military and user sanctions. Back in November, President Trump, maybe it was before November, I'm not positive, President Trump issued Executive Order 13959, which essentially created sanctions against companies that are deemed to be Chinese military companies, even though on the face they might not appear to be military. That at that time, those companies were listed by the Department of Defense under Section 1237 of the NDAA. President Biden more recently amended President Trump's executive order, leaving it largely in place, changing some procedural aspects to it, but leaving these companies listed in place. The sanction in this case is that U.S. persons are prohibited from engaging in securities involving these Chinese military end user companies. In addition, the Department of Commerce, under the BIS, has listed these companies and required special export licenses for exports to these companies. So if you are exporting to any Chinese companies, you need to be sure to check the BIS, it's called the MEU list, military end user, and make sure that you are getting the appropriate license for your export. One of the interesting things about all three of these, I noted the Anti-Money Laundering Act came under the National Defense Authorization Act. President Biden's presidential memorandum on corruption expressly notices the national security connection. And of course, the Chinese military end user sanctions that originally comes out of the Department of Defense, the NDAA, Section 1237. So in other words, all of these have a national security nexus. And that is more and more what we're seeing is an awareness that many of the illicit finance concerns have national security implications. And I believe that we're going to continue to see emphasis on that aspect of these concerns. So something somewhat unique to Exim Bank is in Exim Bank's reauthorization, there was, in 2019, there was a new Section 408, which requires Exim Bank to report to Congress, to our oversight committees, all transactions greater than 25 million in which any obligor, end user, or lender is either owned or controlled by any arm of the government of China, any Chinese state-owned entity, or any agent working for either of them. And some of you will have noticed that Exim Bank's due diligence in this regard has increased for these transactions. We're asking more questions about Chinese ownership and control, and this is why. This provision mirrors very closely OFAC sanctions provisions. The OFAC sanctions provisions, of course, prohibit U.S. persons from doing certain types of business with the entities involved under those. And this is not a prohibition, this is only a reporting requirement, but the language very much mirrors it. And in particular, the language regarding control. And there is, again, more and more focus on and emphasis on the concerns that there is control, not just by the Chinese, could be by Russian companies, could be by other sanctioned entities, but control that is not connected to ownership. Most of us tend to think of control as somebody owns enough shares in a company so they control the company or they control the board of directors, etc. But there's more and more focus on control being exercised through other means other than ownership. And again, some of you will have noticed that Exim Bank is asking more due diligence questions in this regard. One of the difficulties with doing due diligence on China is that there are so many huge companies that are state-owned companies, have so many subsidiaries. So again, back in November, October, President Trump had sanctioned the Xinjiang Production and Construction Company. This would have been big news, except it came out on the same day that President Trump indicated he was going to ban TikTok, and that grabbed everybody's attention. But this was big news. Xinjiang Production and Construction Company is a huge company in China. It is also an administrative entity. It is often called a state within a state. And the reason it's sanctioned is because it is the administrative entity that essentially governs the Uyghur the Xinjiang area. And this company is involved very directly with the human rights abuses regarding the Uyghur population. This company has 800 subsidiaries, over 800 subsidiaries, highly complex ownership structure, in addition to its administrative function of approving other companies. Other companies that we have seen also have these huge subsidiary bases, making due diligence incredibly difficult, both for purposes of the OFAC 50% rule, in which we are required to understand the parental ownership up to 50%, as well as control issues. This area is so complicated that, for my part at least, and other people I've spoken to share this view, it's not only difficult to stay on top of the due diligence related to these companies, it's difficult to stay on top of the vendors that are out there that can help you do the due diligence related to these companies. The vendor community is not only increasing in number, but it's increasing in sophistication. There are lots of tools out there where we are getting more and more information and data, but in some ways it's overwhelming. And it's something we're going to have to continue to wrestle with. I welcome any questions or comments at the end regarding ideas for this kind of due diligence, because it is something that we continue to wrestle with. So that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation and the end of the presentation overall. We would like you to submit any questions you might have, as I believe Lisa mentioned earlier, through the chat function, and we will try to address them. Thank you very much.